In this podcast episode, host Rich Roll sits down with nutrition science expert Simon Hill to critically examine the recent changes to America's dietary guidelines, specifically the updated food pyramid introduced during the Trump administration. Together, they discuss the political and scientific controversies behind the guidelines, the emphasis on protein, particularly animal protein, the role of saturated fat, the impact of food environment and policy, and the ongoing confusion surrounding nutrition messaging. They also touch on the practical implications of these guidelines in public health and individual dietary choices. Simon begins by emphasizing that the new guidelines share more similarities than differences with prior recommendations. A major positive shift is the explicit emphasis on eating real food, or whole, minimally processed foods, and the more direct discouragement of hyper-processed, ultra-processed foods, characterized by high fat, sugar, and sodium content. This focus aims to counteract the rise of calorie-dense, hyperpalatable foods responsible for metabolic diseases. Despite this, long-standing advice to limit saturated fat to under 10% of daily calories remains intact, contrary to some media claims suggesting a change. However, the visually inverted food pyramid prominently features full-fat dairy, red meat, butter, and tallow, foods high in saturated fat, creating an apparent contradiction between the text and imagery. This mixed messaging complicates actually adhering to the saturated fat limit if people follow the pyramid literally, which Simon finds problematic. Simon reveals a significant disconnect between the Scientific Advisory Committee's report and the final published guidelines. The Advisory Committee, composed of top nutrition scientists including Christopher Gardner, recommended more plant-forward dietary patterns focusing on vegetables, legumes, nuts, whole grains, fish, and unsaturated fats, with no prioritization of red meat or beef tallow. The Trump administration sidelined these recommendations and convened a different panel that crafted a separate scientific foundation report. Ultimately, Simon suggests that politicians, rather than scientists, finalize the dietary guidelines, implying that corporate interests and personal biases may influence decisions. This shift away from evidence-based recommendations introduces conflicts and inconsistencies in the messaging. A prominent feature of the new guidelines is an emphasis on increasing protein intake, with special focus on animal-based sources such as red meat, poultry, and full-fat dairy. Simon and Rich discuss how this could mislead the public, who may believe that higher protein consumption, particularly from animal sources, is necessary and beneficial. In reality, the average American already consumes about 1-2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily, which research identifies as sufficient for muscle maintenance and growth when combined with resistance training. Protein deficiency is rare. Rather, the widespread issue is physical inactivity. Research cited by Simon involving notable protein scientists like Stuart Phillips and Luke Van Loon shows no significant difference in muscle strength or size outcomes between omnivorous and fully plant-based protein diets, even in older adults experiencing age-related muscle loss, sarcopenia. Plant proteins may have slower digestion rates, but total muscle protein synthesis over time is comparable. Moreover, plant proteins offer added health benefits through fiber and phytochemicals, improving cardiovascular and metabolic profiles, factors not reflected in the narrow definition of quality protein focused solely on muscle. The guidelines' acceptance of saturated fat limits under 10% remains unchanged, but their promotion of full-fat dairy, butter, and tallow is puzzling. Simon explains that full-fat dairy is a complex category with varying effects depending on the specific product and comparison context. For example, cheese may improve cholesterol compared to butter, but raises cholesterol relative to nuts and seeds. The inclusion of butter and tallow runs counter to a strong scientific consensus, advising against their consumption due to negative cardiovascular effects. Simon offers a charitable interpretation that recommending full-fat dairy in schools may aim to reduce sugar added to low-fat flavored milk, but overall, the messaging feels inconsistent and contradictory. He also notes that the guidelines do not address lactose intolerance or provide clear guidance regarding nutrient adequacy in plant-based dairy alternatives. Despite media focus on the demonization of seed and vegetable oils by certain public figures like RFK Jr., the the guidelines omit any commentary on these oils, neither recommending nor discouraging their use. This omission stands out given that seed oils are rich sources of essential fatty acids and have been promoted by major health organizations for cardiovascular benefits. Simon highlights the irony that the guidelines recommend oils rich in essential fats, such as olive oil, though olive oil contains only small amounts of these fats, and that the administration's messaging both implicitly endorses and neglects discussions around these fats. Simon and Rich delve into how contradictory messaging undermines public understanding and compliance. The pyramidal graphic suggests prioritizing animal proteins and full-fat dairy, yet the textual guidance limits saturated fat intake, which is difficult to achieve following those visual cues. Further, the guidelines emphasize protein, but largely ignore that 95% of Americans fail to meet fiber recommendations, an issue where plant proteins can simultaneously improve fiber intake and overall diet quality. Scientific organizations such as the American Heart Association and leading researchers have criticized the guidelines' departures from evidence-based standards, highlighting procedural problems with how the guidelines were produced. Still, Simon acknowledges that most Americans do not fully follow dietary guidelines regardless of content, with socioeconomic and environmental factors playing a massive role. The discussion shifts to the broader context of food environments and public health policy. Simon and Rich underscore that individual willpower alone cannot overcome structural barriers such as limited access to healthy foods, affordability, social determinants, and environmental influences on diet. The majority of calories consumed in the U.S. come from ultra-processed foods due to marketing, availability, and pricing structures. Reforming these structural issues through policy changes, such as banning unhealthy foods in schools, improving food procurement systems, and creating supportive environments, is essential for meaningful public health improvements. The new guidelines' emphasis on personal choice does not address these systemic problems, limiting their effectiveness. While the guidelines put protein front and center, Simon points out that protein's significance extends beyond muscle synthesis, including increased satiety and replacement of less healthy calories. However, prevailing cultural narratives exaggerate the need for higher protein intake, which fuels demand for animal protein. Public misconceptions conflate protein quantity with quality, often favoring animal sources over plants, based on assumptions about amino acid completeness and digestibility. Yet emerging research refutes these assumptions by demonstrating plant protein's equivalence in supporting muscle growth and improved chronic disease outcomes when consumed adequately. Simon praises the current guidelines for their improved public-facing communication, utilizing social media and accessible websites to engage individuals more directly than prior iterations, which were often bureaucratic and policy-heavy. He also highlights initiatives like realfood.proof.com, a resource that distills advisory committee recommendations into understandable advice that navigates myths and clarifies practical nutrition choices. Nevertheless, he advocates for clearer guidance on protein sources, fiber intake, and food substitutions, similar to policies in countries like Canada and Finland, which provide explicit "eat less of this, eat more of that" directives. A recurring theme is the interplay between diet and physical activity, especially resistance training in preserving muscle and health span. Simon stresses that without sufficient mechanical stimulus, simply increasing protein intake, regardless of source, does not prevent age-related muscle loss. Therefore, dietary recommendations should be accompanied by explicit encouragement of exercise, an aspect missing in the guidelines. Simon and Rich consider the influence of food industry interests and personal biases, notably those of RFK Jr., on shaping the guidelines. While acknowledging good intentions around improving health messaging, they recognize the risks when anecdotal experiences and industry pressures override scientific evidence. This contributes to the contradictions seen in promoting saturated fats-rich animal products while advising saturated fat limits. They conclude with a call to redefine quality protein and healthy eating by integrating chronic disease risks and nutritional benefits beyond just muscle health. Plant proteins contribute to reduced cardiovascular risk, improved glucose metabolism, and lower mortality rates, benefits not captured by a narrow protein-centric model. Thus, dietary guidelines need to reflect a multidimensional understanding of health outcomes. Simon expresses the hope for more nuanced future guidelines that explicitly position plant proteins as valuable replacements for animal protein, emphasize fiber intake, promote real food, and recognize diversity in individual needs and cultural contexts. He supports combined top-down policy reforms and grassroots education to create environments where healthy choices are accessible and normative.